if I see a plant that's just made it through the pavement, I want to cheer it. When I go back to some of the coastlines, some of them are not there. I want people to stop and think and look. I'm a guerrilla gardener, so I'm planting in the street. And we've seen within 3 years insects return. I got excited to see worms.
In this episode of Climate Forward, I sit down with artist and European Climate Pact Ambassador Lilian Cooper. Her work carries a quiet power. She draws disappearing coastlines, follows the rising tide line across beaches, restores forgotten plants in small urban gardens, and collaborates with scientists to make the abstract realities of climate change tangible. I'm Manso Philipp Karabagi, and this is Climate Forward. Lilian Cooper, yes. Welcome to Climate Forward.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show today, where we'll talk about your work as an artist, maybe some other non-art related work, but also your role in the European Climate Pact as an ambassador. Can you please start by introducing yourself with a few words? What is it that you do?
I'm an artist working on climate change. My work is nature-based. I make drawings. I'm really a witness to what is happening. And because my career has been now spanning 3 decades, I'm really starting to see change, even within my own art production.
And you recently joined the European Climate Pact as an ambassador?
Yes, this last January I joined. I only recently discovered the project, and I felt I couldn't keep doing what I do alone. We're a team. We really need to reach out. And what I really enjoy about the Climate Pact is it's so diverse. There are people coming from so many different walks of life, and yet we all share this one aim to help, to change, and to make people aware.
I know that if you join the pact, you do a few commitments. You will share how you want to make a difference with your work in the pact. What are the things that you would like to achieve with your participation?
I would like to reach out to more people. I think that's one of my goals. It's to make also art a recognized medium for passing on this message, because I think artists have a very relevant role to play within society, and sometimes we're sidelined. And yet we're very diverse, and we move across all kinds of cultural and work boundaries. So I can talk to a workman on the street, I can talk to a gardener, but I can also be talking to the director of a large research institute. That bridging effect of an artist is incredibly useful when you're trying to bring a message across. When you passionately care, as I and many of our colleagues do in the Pact, about doing something.
And then that's a good bridge to your work, I think. Doing something. Share a little bit with us. What is it that you do in your work?
Well, I started now just over 27 years ago working on the Coastline project, which is to draw the rock edges of the North Atlantic.
I would assume that in your work of the coastlines, when you look back 27 years ago, you see some change.
When I go back to some of the coastlines, some of them are not there. I worked on the Île La Madeleine in maritime Quebec, and it's a very soft sandstone. You can actually touch it. It's friable. It comes off in your hands. It's barely more sand than stone. And yes, the headlands that I drew no longer exist, which is quite a sobering thought. But it was also very interesting to be in these locations where people would say things like, they'd go to their neighbours and they'd say, I think I have a bit of a problem. And the local community would gather round and they would check the soil and they say, yes, the water is rising. So the seawater was entering into the landscape to the point that the ground was so sodden that the house has to be moved. And then it is physically 2-story houses are actually moved up the slope.
You were just talking about we touched upon the the shorelines, the coastlines that you were drawing for a long, long time. You still do this today? Is that still something that's ongoing?
It is an ongoing project. I had left it to one side for a while because I have been rather obsessed by my recent research. But yes, I'm longing to get back.
What are your recent projects then that take up your time?
Well, at this very moment, I'm working on a project about the rehabilitation of weeds. So I'm working on a project about the medical use of historical medical use of plants. Taking something that people actually revile, like a dandelion, or at the moment I also produced a book on and stinging nettles, which are really not popular. I mean, you have to work quite hard on the PR for these plants. And there's something extraordinary when you read about it and you see the uses and the fact that we have lost all that knowledge so quickly.
There are probably a lot of plants that are put into a certain category, or if we're talking about weeds, I do think that we are, as a world, a little bit evolving from very black and white thinking, this is a good plant, this is a bad plant, more towards it depends. There's also a connection to the Climate Pact here, right? Because
yes,
on the one hand, this is about the, removing the stigmata of certain plants or weeds, as you called them before.
They are, in fact, not weeds. I'm working with historical data, so I'm working in research libraries looking at 16th century, 17th century herbaria, where these plants are obviously listed completely differently and listed for their use, not for their weed quality, which is a fairly new concept. Many people say a weed is just a plant in the wrong place. And I firmly believe that. In fact, I'm not even sure that there is a wrong place.
And how is this project connected to the Climate Pact or to sustainability?
It's connected to the idea that we need green everywhere. So I'm growing these plants in my garden. I'm building a 17th century garden in my own garden.
Sorry, what is a 17th century garden?
I'm using the example of the Snippendal garden in the Hortus Botanicus Amsterdam, which was one of the earliest medicinal gardens. And they produced lists of the plants in their gardens, so you can use that, and I use that to recreate the garden in my own garden. And I also am a guerrilla gardener, so I'm planting in the street. My neighbours are now planting in the street. We're mixing wild with more cultivated varieties of plant, and we've seen within 3 years insects return, butterflies. I got excited to see worms. It was barren. And now to do something so small and yet to have such an impact on the landscape, but on the people, I think the perception of people walking past is enormous. And so that's like a tiny example of what I within the Climate Pact want to do, is show by example, by showing the beauty of these objects, of these plants or these rocks or the trees. I want people to stop and think and look. And the only way they're going to do that is by a level of enjoyment. I don't want it to be a waving finger, look at this, it's good for you. It's about, I suppose to a degree, it's about finding joy in our environment. And, if I see a plant that's just made it through the pavement, I'm like, I want to cheer it.
The resilience of nature.
Yes.
I think, it is connected somehow to biodiversity. I think something that we, especially if you look at industrialized agriculture, maybe even particularly here in the Netherlands, there's in certain areas definitely a lack of, and bringing a more diverse range of plants or greens that enhance each other is something we probably need. I would assume.
I'm a little worried that actually that nature is perceived as something that one goes and experiences, whereas nature is everywhere. Even in our urban environments, it's trying to squeeze its way through the paving stones. I think that's something else that even within the pact I meet people who are not always thinking, hang on, nature is everything. It's the mold that is growing on the paving stone. It's the lichens that are growing up the wall. It's just smaller scale. We have to change our scale when we look at them. It's not the dramatic magnificence of a church painting of American wilderness, but it's still valid. It's just all we have in many cases, and we should just nurture it. In urban environments, we see sometimes magnificent roof gardens built, accidentally often by the birds. We see green roofs, we see people's gardens. The Natuurmonumenten in the Netherlands at one point suggested we could make an extra national park by interconnecting people's gardens, which I thought was an absolutely beautiful concept, but did require an awful lot of people to give up their paving stones. Which I'm not sure is going to fully work. Idea fabulous, exercising it, not so sure. But I think it's really, I think we have to recognize that it isn't one or the other, but it is predominantly one, predominantly urban or predominantly non-urban.
And is that something that you also encounter in your work, or that makes part of your artistic practice, this encouragement to bring more nature into the cities, or?
I think it also stems partly from my initial training as an architect, so that I'm very aware of my urban environment, because I now live in an urban environment, having grown up in a small village in a national park. So I'm much more aware of my environment than I might be had I always grown up in the city.
And when did you discover this interest in nature, and how did that come about?
I can pinpoint the moment when I really started thinking about climate.
So do tell.
Yes, I was watching television, and a school friend of mine was on television. He's now a professor of climate studies in Oxford, and he predicted our present climate situation. Only everyone at the time thought he was exaggerating. Turns out he actually miscalculated a little bit and was playing it down, and in fact it happened faster than he predicted. But it was for the BBC, and it had to be tamed because the message would have been a bit frightening. And as it was, everyone felt discrediting it and ignoring it would be the best option. But I never forgot that. When it's someone you know, whose opinion you know is well researched, and he wouldn't say that for no reason. It followed on from childhood discussions with my parents about climate, about farming, about respect for nature, which I was brought up with. My father had a lot of farming in the family. So it was a point where I thought, I can no longer ignore this. I cannot, as a responsible human being, working also with nature, because by this point I was already working, in fact I think I was working in a pink granite quarry on the Isle of Mull at the time. I was really aware of being in precious environments, and it was time that I actually stood up and did something about this.
I know that you're right, we were talking about the coastlines, yes. But there is another project that's very dear to you that is connected to the coast, which is the tidelines.
Yes. Tidelines was a project I did. It was a quite defined project. It's only 3 years long. My projects all tend to be years rather than weeks. And this was about rising sea levels. And it was during lockdown, so it was a perfect time to take the bicycle, be entirely on my own on the coastline, drawing initially in The Hague. So I thought it was very poetic to be in a landscape where, in fact, my Dutch family had been for 250 years. So it was a really interesting space. It was also quite scary to see the reaction of passers-by, some whom would just actually verbally abuse me for drawing tides. I was drawing the line of the tide as it came in over my paper. So every 5 minutes I would make a new series of drawings. I would work for 3 or 4 hours. These drawings would then be bound, and they would be produced as books. I produced an artist book at the same time, and very kindly the introduction was written by the director of the IHE, the UNESCO IHE Water Education Institute in Delft. And Eddie Moores and I have worked together on another project as well, because there's a really interesting synergy between scientific research and the artistic language, which he's very interested in. And we connected on that level, which was fascinating. So that book is in fact in many collections now, because I've touched a nerve, I feel. And it is really important, and I'm very blessed to be lucky, but also I feel it's a way of making something so abstract as rising sea levels actually tangible by drawing it. And this wasn't just based in The Hague. Afterwards, I went to Zeeland, I went to Ostende, and I went to the Ile de Ré in France, where that's actually flooded. Parts of it, for 50% of the island, was lost in serious storms. It's bounced back again, but I wanted to take areas which were under threat of flooding. By doing something so clean and so simple and so elemental, I wanted to bring that message over without creating fear or threatening for the majority of people. No one was, yeah.
And did you pursue this a little bit, or what is the outcome of the project? So there's this book. Did you also, connect this to the literal, documentation of rising sea levels, or?
No, it's a series of books of the actual drawings. It's an artist's book, and I also gave a lecture as part of a symposium which was created for my project on. At the IHE in Delft on art and science.
Okay, can you tell a little bit more on this connection between art and science? Because I do think that's also something that is not the first obvious thing when you think about this.
Well, it's a growing field because it's very difficult to communicate a lot of hard facts as data in a manner that would actually appeal to people, make it last more than 2 minutes in anyone's memory, because quite frankly, faced with a large sheaf of data, information, it can get a tiny bit dry. And
I agree.
It is actually quite difficult for the general public to grasp it. Whereas if it's a drawing, or it's actually, because this was all, I think you could call it performance as well. Mm-hmm. When you see somebody working like that on the coast every few minutes, there was a little film made of me. It's very interesting, and it becomes suddenly, what is she doing? Not, here is a list of the data of the rising tides.
So it gives a new perspective.
It gives a different perspective. It supplements, shall we say. But it can do more than that. My other project with the IHE, for example, was, and how I initially got to know them, was I was working on a water project on water quality. And I was learning about water quality thanks to them, but also fishing out all the rubbish out of the canals in the town I live in, which is Delft.
And water quality of the inland waterways? Then?
Yes, of the canals.
Can you tell a little bit more? What exactly?
Well, it was It was for a museum exhibition. I was commissioned to make a project on water quality, and I chose to take the water outside my house because I'm lucky enough to live near the canals. And I wanted to capture that. I wanted to learn what was in the water. So I also went to water treatment plants. I spoke to the Hoogheemraadschap in Delft, in Delftlanden, to talk about the water makeup. I went to a treatment plant. All these things, although they're not manifested as data, I incorporated that within my work and my own perspective. Because everywhere I go, every project I work on, including coastlines, I work with experts in the field. So I also took some geology lessons. So I had a better understanding of the rock formations that I work with from the Universiteit van Amsterdam. It's always for also I've had a lot of lovely mailing lists from and book recommendations from like Woods Hole in Boston on the Tideline project. So my, for example, the project that we were going to talk about as well, the Xylotech Unpacked, that was working with a lot of laboratories. And so I was working in plant pathology departments with scientists directly working on their projects.
Bring me with you. How does that look? When you do a project, first of all, I would like to know why you work with scientists, because you could also just go and draw the tide line or observe the water in the canals. But what is it that drives you to bring the scientific aspect in your work?
Well, partly it's my own background. I come from a family of academics. So for me, it was also part of this feeling that I had to bring a message over. If you're going to have a message, that message has to be accurate, in my feeling. I feel I'm a stickler for detail. So I think that for me, research, knowing what the science is behind what I'm doing, why the landscape is behaving as it is, why, for example, there was a dead tree at the top of the mountain near my grandmother's home. And I didn't know why, but I happened to be having a conversation in the Natural History Museum in Brussels, and we were talking about beetles, and and he explained that it was simply water stress, heat stress, and the lack of water, and then sudden downpours where much of it wouldn't be absorbed, which was stressing these plants so much that pine-boring beetles and insects of that nature would pick, strangely, only the pine trees out, and they would consume them. So this is a forest of living trees and dead pine trees. It's a very weird landscape. So I always want to know what's happening. So, of course, I find out. I talk to somebody. That's a small example. I'm the visiting artist for the Botanic Gardens of Leiden. I occasionally bother the very generous botanist who will answer some of my questions. He still hasn't fully forgiven me, I think, for the question I asked about non-native trees, because I've drawn several of them as long-term drawing projects, but these trees are not native to the Netherlands. They're not even native to this hemisphere. So when this tree is planted and has been living here for over 200 years, does it integrate more? Does it sustain more insect life than a tree only 50 years in the country? I don't know. I don't know how fast it changes. I asked him, he says he doesn't know either. So there's some student who may be cursing me at this moment because their job is to count the insects. Because, of course, you have this non-native plant, and a non-native plant sustains normally only 15% of native plant insect life.
Oh, it's amazing how your work as an artist brings you towards insights like this. I mean, I find this super, I did not know at all that there's such a difference in biodiversity that you introduce.
Yes, and I didn't know either, but it's through seeing these things and asking questions.
Yeah, I like how you search for a scientific foundation of many of the projects that you're pursuing. And I know we're jumping around a little bit from, there's a rough connection between coastlines, tidelines, and more. And now we're at the trees, but talking about more green things and the ocean, I do know that you also have a project that looks at seaweed.
Yes.
And I would like to touch upon this also still.
Yes, the seaweed is, although 7 years old as project, and I'm still working on it. At the moment, I'm working with we're making a project of a professor formerly of the National Museum Naturel. No, I beg your pardon. Museum National de l'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, who she's now going to be working in the Sorbonne station in Roscoff. And she's a seaweed specialist for years. She wants to work on a project with me where we illustrate it with kelp, because of course of the importance, again, to go back to forests, of kelp forests with their absorption of CO2, it being so much more significant than we ever realized. But there are so many aspects of seaweed that it's such a growing interest in the general public, which is wonderful. But it's also important, and therefore I feel I have to know about it from a scientific point of view as well. For me, a project isn't whole if I haven't looked at many aspects of it.
And what do you want to do with this project, or what in the project, I should rather say?
Well, I've been actually working with seaweed for longer than this project. I've been working with seaweed I worked with the State Herbarium of South Australia, who were actually instrumental in introducing me to seaweed. Carolyn Ritchie, thank you. I really didn't realize or recognize the significance of seaweed. I would work on coastlines and I would just see seaweed. I then started learning about seaweed. Now when I go to the coast and I see seaweed floating in the sea, I'm so excited. I'm like wanting to get out an app to identify these plants as they're floating. I feel like I'm in a floating herbarium. But what I really found interesting, for example, is that I was in Brittany looking at rocks, but I also discovered in Quimper, in south of Brittany, they had the collection of Monsieur de Bonmaison, who had collected one of the earliest seaweed collections in the herbaria. And what was really interesting is 50 years on, les Frères Crouan, also in Brittany, because Brittany is rich in seaweed, named one of their seaweeds after Monsieur de Bonmaison. So Bonmaisonia is actually named after him, which I thought was just the most wonderful concept, that you could have something named after you like this.
Lovely.
Yeah, and it's a sort of honor title. And I now quite frequently see Bonmaisonia floating, and I get quite excited.
Quite rightfully so, I guess. So I like, and I see this thread in your work, that you always, or at least in the projects you mentioned to me recently, you always work with a scientific institution or with a specific scientist to support your work.
Yes.
Is that on purpose, or is this something that just happens? Or?
Well, initially it was almost accidental. For example, when I started on the one of the starting points for the Xylotech was a meeting I had in the herbarium in the Royal Botanic Gardens of Sydney in their plant pathology department, and Ed Liu helped me tremendously. And he really was he introduced me to a particular type of plant disease, which shocked me profoundly, but also opened my eyes. And then I actually work with electron microscopes and ordinary microscopes to see the detail. So I'm working on all different scales. Whether this was a conscious, I think it started maybe as a few very interesting meetings, but it became so fulfilling that I couldn't leave it alone. So I find that for me, it's all about research, but it's not just about the scientific research. I look at museum collections. The Xylotech began because I saw an original Xylotech, which had been built by Friedrich Slumbach of Nuremberg.
And for the people who don't know what the Xylotech is, do you mind explaining?
Yes, of course, because most people don't know. I certainly didn't know what it was.
Me included, I did not.
No, it's a library of wood. It's essentially a library of wood samples. But this particular Xylotech is in Huis Groeneveld, or now Kasteel Groeneveld in Bern. And it's the most extraordinary collection. It's bound like a book. The spine of the book is made from the wood that it describes. So I loved that incredible connection, this old, redundant scientific data being reused and having a artistic value as well. I mean, these were really beautiful.
Coming full circle now to the beginning when we spoke about the Climate Pact, does that aspect also make part of the goals or the things you want to achieve, that people understand the importance of diversity in nature, in insects around us?
I worry no. And so that is part of I think is part of my role. But I, not being a scientist, see myself more as, shall we say, the PR agent for the insects, rather than a scientist who can exactly tell you where these insects are, their significance. Yes, I mean, for me, if I've drawn them, I have to know, are they common, are they not common, what is their natural habitat, how do they like to live? That's also natural curiosity. I've got an overactive curiosity. But I want to make other people as curious as me. I think we need to start asking questions. Much like when we go into supermarkets, many people don't ask where these things come from. You ask many children, they might think that the meat and vegetables come from plastic. I think we need to make connections. And that's one of my roles, I think, within the Climate Pact, is to make those sort of connections.
Yeah, and when you say this, I also immediately get the feeling that very often the scientific, the dry scientific background, foundation, the data is much more challenging to comprehend or to relate to than maybe something that has been translated in a much more engaging art project in your instance.
I think because we are very visual, we have become a very visual culture. Much of our lives are surrounded by telephones, it's by images on phones, it's by advertising, walking around, everything is image. So to speak to people in image language is probably a good language to use. We are much more unconsciously educated in visual language, all of us, whatever our training, because of our environment. But sadly, sometimes we miss the awareness of and the significance of insects, worms in my garden. These are important. And we need to, in many places, because so many pesticides are being used in the countryside, the diversity of nature is actually stronger in urban environments. If you look at things like down my street, we had a hedgehog. My Australian neighbour had never seen one, so I had to explain to him about it, which was also quite fun. But it's this sort of constant. It's being aware, it's sharing, it's recognizing that we need to make this accessible. And dry data can be quite exciting too, I admit. I get quite interested by it. But I like to make it so accessible that everyone can enjoy it.
I think that's a great closing word, to be honest. I couldn't have said that better. It was very fascinating to hear about your practice, all the work that you do. And I think that art is another puzzle piece in talking about climate change and talking about the challenges that our world faces today. And it can be a beautiful way of bringing a topic to more people in a new way. So I really like that.
I think art has always played an incredibly living role in our lives. And I think sometimes we forget that now. But we only have to look at places like Lascaux to know that art has always been part of humanity.
Well, Lilian, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with me and have this super interesting conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I wish you all the best for the future. Is there a project that you're working on at the moment and that you still want to mention, or maybe you can already share a little bit what are you working on now?
Well, there is one project that I'm at the moment fundraising for, which is very dear to my heart. It is a development on the herbarium series. I'm building a chained library based on medieval chain libraries, and I'm using it. It's a library of banned languages. So I'm taking.
Sorry, what is a chained library?
Again, only thanks to my research have I found out about chained libraries. In Hereford Cathedral, for example, there is still one of the earliest remaining chained libraries. It's a library usually of manuscripts, which are physically chained to reading tables, partly, I think, because books were so valuable and you can't trust an academic. I wanted to use that language of chains to use it also with the idea of banned languages, because I have many cultures in my background and I know many people of diverse cultures. So I'm also looking at the Basque country because, of course, working there drew me very much to the Basque culture, and I know a Basque scholar who will, I hope, can help me on this. My sister is a fluent Gaelic speaker, so she's going to help me on the banned Gaelic because that was also banned. It just increases. Everyone I know has contact with a banned language of some form. And I love the idea that there are these books chained with the languages that are bound in them and that are also banned. So that's my project at the moment.
Well, the best of luck with this. It does
Thank
sound really, really interesting. So I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing and hearing more about this in the future. Lilian, once again, thank you very much for joining me today, and all the best for the future.
Thank you.
In this episode, we explored how Lilian Cooper's art makes the shifting edges of our climate visible. From coastlines and gardens to the overlooked beauty of weeds and insects. Her reflections remind us that creativity can open pathways to understanding where numbers fall short. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this, subscribe to Climate Forward and join me as I speak with changemakers who are building a sustainable future.